Okay, so what am I talking about today? I'm talking about, so normally I walk around a lot when I present, which might not work, so I'm going to stand like this. I'm talking about qualitative methods and the purpose of why we might use qualitative methods in pastoral settings. And when I was thinking about this talk, there's a huge range of people in this room, okay? Some of you are near the end of your PhD fieldwork, and you've been using qualitative methods for years. Others of you are statisticians, and like my dear friend and colleague who says, please don't make me talk to real people, I'm terrified of people, right? Not all statisticians are like that, but I'm here to talk about how and why qualitative methods can be really useful. And for those of you who think that it doesn't count as data, I'm here to change your mind, okay? So, but just recognizing that I know that you're all coming from different places, and some of you might say, yes, I've known that since I could walk. Okay, so a very brief overview of the presentation. This is one of the network style mappings that Wachira talked about yesterday. We're going to talk about what qualitative tools are, why you would use them, when and how they are best employed. Then we're going to have 2 very short sessions to keep you all awake that I'm calling table talk, where you talk to your colleagues for 10 minutes or so. Then we'll talk about examples of tools, the process, like how do you even go about this, designing a qualitative research study, and what skills do people need to do qualitative research? How do you train someone to do qualitative research? And then another round of discussion, and then thinking about qualitative tools in pastoral settings in particular. And then we'll have a break, and then we will talk specifically about your field work tomorrow, building off of this presentation. So you're not going to go to the field tomorrow totally blind. We're going to give you guidance, some sample questions, etc.
I can help you with this.
Sure. That's very nice of you, except I have various animations later on. Okay, what and why? Again, I'm just doing this part quickly because for many of you, this is old news. What is the big concept of qualitative data? The concept is that you're gathering information through conversation, through discussion. Sometimes also, or instead of it, through observation, okay? Anthropologists, for instance, when they have lots of time, they join a community. And they try to sort of become part of the woodwork, and they're observing while they're chatting, right? But they're mainly using observation. And then I briefly wanted to talk about some of the terms, because we all hear terminology, and often, if I were to say, well, what does that actually mean? Sometimes it's less clear, okay? So in qualitative data, we talk a lot about focus group discussions, or FGDs. That's a group conversation. That's all that means, okay? We talk about key informant interviews. That's when you target a specific person, okay? I go to Roble and I said, I really want to understand about, I need to talk to someone who understands climate change in Somaliland. I say, oh, he's my guy. And I do a more directed conversation with him about those topics. That's me finding a key informant and interviewing him or her. We also have individual ideas about what kind of thing I want to ask him. Where did you decide you liked this work? What was your education? Oh, your parents wanted you to be a doctor. How did they feel? You know, sort of a natural conversation about these things, okay? And then we have something called participatory exercises, which are sometimes called PRAs, for participatory rural appraisals. But people say participatory exercises, people say PRAs. I'll talk more about those in a minute, and that's also what you talked about with Wachira yesterday. That's when you're doing a focus group, but I'm giving this group here of these 5 men a task. And I'm saying, through this task, I want you to explain to me the type of livestock in your community and how they're managed. So it's more directed, and I'm really wanting them to participate, okay? And then why do we use them? Why do we care about qualitative methods? This is where I'm really trying to convert you, okay? We care about qualitative methods because they get at the why question. You can have statistical representative data from a survey till the cows come home, but it can't tell you why from people's perspectives. You can unpack causality through multiple regression analyses, right? But I can't say, why did you take your cows to the Wasso last year? What was your route? What were your challenges? That is a conversation, right? And it's much more effective to have that as a conversation than to be trying to tick boxes and make his journey fit into a survey design, okay? Also to add nuance, to better understand the differences, the depth, the breadth of people's experiences that you can't get out of survey results, okay? Really critically to incorporate local voices and perspectives. There is no voice in a survey, okay? There is no story in a survey. As you did with Ian's Rivers of Life exercise, all of you are here because of your story, right? That makes you who you are. So if I'm a researcher and I really want to understand you and your life and your community and your household and your aspirations and your struggles, I need to understand the story of you or your family or your community. And that's through conversation, okay? To explore sensitive topics, right? We can include sensitive topics in surveys, but it's very difficult. You ask a sexual assault survivor a yes or no question, it's very easy for that individual to say, no, I don't want that box. That's a natural human reaction, right? When we're doing qualitative interviews, you can talk about sensitive topics based on the environment, based on the setting, based on building trust. But you can also follow up in areas that you might not know were sensitive. In a survey, if I ask a woman how many children she has, standard survey question. Next question, ma'am, how many children do you have? She said, I had 6, 4 of them have died. I had 6, only 2 of them reached the age of 5 years. On the survey, your next question is, how about bicycles? Do you have any bicycles? Right? In a qualitative interview, I say, I'm so sorry to hear that. That's really, must have been so difficult for your family. And I can gauge if we can talk more about that. Obviously, in some cultures, you don't talk about death. But if I see that she wants to talk more, I can say, do you mind if I ask what the circumstances were? And then she explains to me it was in a cattle raid, or because of a drought, or because she wasn't able to get them vaccinated, or whatever the case may be, right? And I suddenly am understanding her story in a way that I would never have understood it if my next question was about household assets and how many bicycles do you have, okay? And then critically, a beautiful, beautiful thing about qualitative data collection is that it allows for learning along the way. Because you're not beholden to a survey that if I ask you 10 questions and I ask you 11 and I ask you 12, but then I subtract 1 and ask you 10 and a half, I can't compare my data. With a survey, I can say, I learned yesterday that this is an issue in this community. I didn't know that. So tomorrow, I'm going to ask about that issue. Then I learned that it's more complicated than that. So the next person, I'm going to ask for come at it from a slightly different perspective. So you can build on what you learn. Again, much more normally, right? Like hanging out with a friend. You follow up. You ask them different things. They tell you they lost their job last week. You're probably going to ask about that next time you see them. Next slide. Okay. How and when and how do you use qualitative tools? The when can be many, many times. Often, it's used as part of a design and investigation phase, okay? I say, I want to run a big survey in Chad, a big mixed method study. We have to figure out what the underlying issues are, what the background context is, what we should be talking about, where we should be working, who we should be talking to, whether it's going to be qualitative and quantitative or even just quantitative. So it informs your study. As a mixed method study, to complement or explain survey data, coming back to the fact that quantitative data does not answer the why question. So let's say I get my survey results, I analyze them, and I say, I'm looking at two different communities here in my survey data, and I see that this community really has much more conflict or acute malnutrition or livestock loss, whatever we're looking at, compared to this community. But on the face of it, they're very similar communities. I wonder why that is. The statistician often cannot answer that question. The qualitative researcher can go back in and probe through qualitative methods what is the difference between the outcomes in this community and the outcomes in this community, and why might they exist. And you can only get that through qualitative data. Okay, so that's the value of a mixed method study. Also, a mixed method study allows you to do much more in-depth follow-up. Okay, so you notice patterns in the survey data. You want to unpack them. You want to talk to more people. So let's say we're doing a nutrition survey. We're talking to parents of children under 5 years, primarily women, right? But we know that's only one small sector of the broader community and the institutions and the systems and the processes that are informing all of these aspects that underline malnutrition. So we could do qualitative data and talk to husbands, to leaders, to traders, to health workers, etc., and try to understand some of these patterns that we're not going to be able to get just from the women who have children under age 5. Okay? And then, of course, in specific context where quantitative data is not possible, very dispersed areas, hard to reach locations, if you're talking about topics that people are not going to want to answer in a survey, and then any questions better suited to qualitative inquiry, right? More nuanced questions, deeper comparative analysis, focusing in areas that are maybe not typical. I don't want to generalize. I just want to understand fishing in Leongalani town. Okay, and I just want to do a selective survey, a selective sample where I'm focusing on fishermen. You're a fisherman? Great. You're not? I don't want to talk to you. You're a fisherman? Great, etc. So you can really build out your sample. And then how? Your methods are always going to be designed to reflect your research questions. This is qual or quant, of course, right? The methods reflect the questions. Critically, as with any research, local context and expertise is essential because otherwise you don't know what to ask. Okay? I can't take my qualitative design that I came up with in Malawi and take it to Marsabit. That is not the same context. You have to go to Mars a bit and understand the context, or work with local people from Mars a bit, the communities, the local researchers, the local community organizations, to design a study that reflects the local reality. Adapting the approach, the example I gave before. You don't always follow the same 10 questions because you're learning as you go. Related to that is real-time flexibility. We discover that a particular trade route that we didn't know about is essential for local livelihoods. So we trace that trade route. We're flexible. We think about what we want to understand. We realize that the start of the rainy season is actually the period we're most interested in because of excess livestock deaths. We adjust our field work accordingly. We narrow down our locations. And it's based on iterative trainings and ongoing discussions. The thing about qualitative work is you have to be willing and able to talk to your team. It's not your survey data that's going to, Kobo Box Central and wherever that is, okay? It's you and it's your team. And you're building on your previous learning as you go. Next slide, please. Okay, so first I want everybody to stand up because I see some potential dancing candidates in the room. Second, stretch. Excellent, excellent. Watch out, I'll make you dance, okay? Okay, now I want you to sit back down and turn to your table mates, and we're only doing this for 5 to 10 minutes. I want you to talk about qualitative methods in your work. What have you used? If you've never used qualitative methods as a researcher, don't worry. What have you read that used qualitative methods? P.S. Anyone who's ever read a newspaper article has read qualitative methods, okay? So talk about what qualitative methods you've come across, and what was your perspective, right? And then lastly, what do you think might be the benefits specifically of doing this in a pastoral setting? Okay, 5 minutes, and then one person's going to report back very briefly, okay? Each group gets to choose the one question or one thing you want to say. Okay, you don't have to answer all 3 questions. So I'm going to start with this table, and the person who wants to stand up and give whatever salient point you think that you want to reflect on from your table. Go ahead.
We will come that opportunity to read the nonverbal cues as people respond, and that all helps in coming up with very good findings and analysis. But there's also a lot of conversation around the negative aspects. Mm-hmm. Qualitative requires, a very skilled researcher, a researcher who's able to make sure you don't deviate so far, or, go into other issues other than what the focus is. And you might end up getting data, especially if the person collecting and analyzing are different people, and you find that the data or the findings they've brought to you does not even respond to the questions maybe you had prepared. Right. Again, there is a lot of nitty-gritties that goes into the planning of qualitative data collection. And that is a lot of work, especially when you're working on very tight timelines in your project, and you need to get done with it as quickly as possible. So that again becomes a limitation. And again, in pastoral communities, in very conservative, you need to be conscious, for example, have a women-only focus group discussions. So planning all that, breaking them into those different groups brings out, again, the negative. But there is a common understanding on this table that in terms of pastoral research, qualitative, as long as it's done by a quality researcher, can really help in building the evidence.
Great.
Yes.
Thank you so much.
Okay, for our group, I think there's a mixed up. There are those who are qualitative and those who are quantitative.
Okay.
maybe I can speak for the qualitative. I'm more exposed to that.
Sure.
And then someone else will take.
Great.
For qualitative, I'm exposed to KI and mostly FGDs. I can say KI has its own advantage and disadvantage. The same with FGD. For KI, you can get in-depth information very well without being influenced by someone else. For the FGD, the people through discussion can argue and get the clear information. But still, one person might be intimidated by others because he's on the table. They can't give you that information.
Of course.
This
Yep.
can be, the information can be biased.
Great. Yeah, that's a really important point. That because you're talking in a group, in a focus group discussion, right? Maybe I have a strong view, or I'm the chief's wife, or the health worker, or whatever, and that can influence what other people share. Definitely. Now, did someone from this table who's more of a quant researcher want to give their perspective?
For an extensive period of time, so you have like a within perspective. So if you take this summer school, for example, it's not just being here and learn about the content of this summer school, but learning about the summer school itself, how it is organized, on what motivations, what are the goals, what are the dynamics, and everything that happens during the day. So it's that double analysis that you can do if you actually give a lot of extra time and just doing things on a daily basis without leading the research process with questions or surveys or even participatory approaches. That's the most qualitative research method, I think, that you can
Great.
get.
Terrific. Thank you so much. Okay, great. Next table.
Reveals different, or rather different dynamics or the voices for the people. So we thought therefore FGD helps the pastoral population in capturing their voices. Yeah.
Great. Terrific. So really thinking about
Most of our members have interacted with FGDs, KIIs, and semi-structured interviews. The biggest advantage of these tools is that they're based on, they give real-life experiences, and the major challenge that we saw is that there's risk of influence, especially in group setting, and also there's fear of talking or the aspect of intimidation during the group setting. Yes, those are
great.
major.
Terrific. Great. So you get the real story, but you always have to be thinking about what am I missing, or what might the biases be here? This table.
Group members interacted with FGD, KII, and some of the BRS. Yeah, participated rural appraisal, like resource mapping, and also buyer-wise ranking and scoring, and also Venn diagram, seasonal calendar, like that. And they said that we have a benefit of having grassroots information. When you interact this qualitative, it's morely you will interact with grassroots level information, which is real. And also we also get as another advantage is like context-specific needs. You have to spend more time with the community, and then you will interact with that the context-specific need, which is very real. So that's in our context.
Terrific. Great. Okay, couple more.
So no point for repeating. And benefits are almost covered, but one of the challenges we discussed include is like when it's covering sensitive topics, like GBV or whatever, maybe different genders could give you challenging. So there is an element of that, the perspective, get involved in it. And another challenge we discussed includes translation. The qualitative is set in certain language and then translated into a local language. There is a risk of that technical terms, fall either in the translation, one asked the local communities or there. And the third challenge, which we discussed, is it's costly and it needs an expert to be engaged. So the quantitative is easier. The rest, the benefits we share with the team. For pastoralists, because it involves real life stories, quantitative is more, suitable.
Great. Excellent.
Yes, we talked about focus groups and also others, but I don't want to repeat what others said. Sure. But one thing that I want to add is when you do qualitative interview to get the first introduction to the community, to the people that you are talking to is very important. Mm-hmm. In my case, for example, I'm in now. After you start, the interview or talking to the people, the first 30 minutes, the first 20 minutes is talking to them, what are you doing, how your daily life looks like, your operation looks like, and then the beautiful story is the last part of the discussion where they have to go for their daily life, and you have to let them go. But that is when the beautiful story, the juice comes out. And I always have to take their names and know where they are so I can come back for the follow-up interview.
Great.
But our friend here told us about when you send the illuminators to collect the interview, and then this is the energy you're setting when they know what they have to ask, and the other person they know what they have to say, so it comes with a negative outcome, which is not really beautiful.
Great.
So we talked all that.
Downsides as well.
Yeah.
Great. Thank you. Terrific. Thanks, everybody. Reflections. And you've raised a lot of critical points about some of the strengths and weaknesses that exist. And often when you talk to implementers about doing qualitative data, they say many of these same parts, particularly having to do with the amount of time. Okay? Oops, wrong way. Okay. So I'm just going to give some brief examples of qualitative tools, recognizing that there are many more. So this table in particular had a whole bunch they had used. This is just to give you a flavor of some of the things that you come across and hear. And I've divided them into two categories. Here we have calendars, where you can think about seasonal calendars, livelihood activity calendars, hazard calendars, disease calendars, livestock births, deaths, disease, milk production calendars. You could add columns for different groups in your calendars. What are men doing at different seasons? What are women doing? How does a livestock calendar by season or month differ based on the species, etc.? So all of these can be adapted in numerous ways. Proportional piling, that is a technique we use within multiple different tools, and it has so many different uses. I missed Wachira's presentation yesterday, but even in network mapping, you can use proportional piling to show the weight of some of those linkages or reliability, okay? So how do communities place different value, ranks, weigh, relying on different sources of information, food, etc. Net mapping you talked about yesterday. Mapping, where you're actually mapping the community, the landscape, the region, the mobility routes, the hazards, the resources, the different groups, etc. Transect walks, where you walk through the communities with people and talk about different aspects. Diaries, asking people to record things over time, right? Lifelines, similar to your rivers of life. Asking people to reflect on different periods in their lives, their highs and lows. Similar to that is historical timelines that you do with a community. And then photo voice, where people who have access to cell phones or cameras, or you give people cameras, you ask them to take photographs of things with meaning to them, and you use those to have a discussion. Okay? Now, all of these on the left-hand side, these are all participatory approaches, and there's many more, right? All participatory approaches are aimed at discussion. So it's not just my pretty seasonal calendar that I want to take a picture of and then write down which month was for, you know, births of goats versus camels or whatever I'm looking at. The purpose is the discussion, okay? It's listening to my group and seeing that they're debating something and then trying to pull out, what was that debate between Ian and Guyo? I see that Ian doesn't agree with that. Excuse me, can you explain why? Which gets us to the importance of note-taking, which I'll talk about more in a minute, right? So it's the process of participation, not just the end result. Okay, we want to focus on the process. On the other side, we have what we might call more standard tools. Focus group discussions, key informant interviews, participant observation, embedded observation. So in the project that we're not talking about because of the donor, on the Karamoja-Turkana border, we are using an embedded research approach where we're following herds with community researchers. So we've trained 12 community researchers, 2 teams of 6. They're embedded with specific herds, and they're moving with those herds for 1 year. Okay, so that is a very in-depth study, qualitative study. And then use of vignettes, which is the sort of thing you did yesterday with Rachma, in Rachma's exercise. That can be really helpful, particularly to investigate a sensitive topic. Okay? So for instance, I give a group, I describe a vignette about cattle raiding. And I don't have to say when the Samburu raid the Turkana, right? Or the Barana, the Gabra, whoever the Samburu raid, right? Instead, I can create a vignette and people can talk about that in a third-person way and share their reflections, okay? So even though these are less participatory, they can be very effective. Okay. This is just a short cycle to think about how one actually does this. And in each of these little boxes, and I'd like to say that Rachma and I broke the internet trying to figure out how to make a pretty cycle like this, so we'd like credit. So each little box has 2 phrases. And this is meant to show the dynamic and fluid aspect of qualitative data, of any data collection really, but particularly qualitative, okay? When we think about a scoping study, that's informing the design, right? And that those 2 things are embedded with each other. We're training researchers while we're testing to see if these tools work. Data collection and note-taking. Qualitative data is useless without good note-taking. Okay? It is not saved in the cloud, right? And then adapting and repeating based on what you're learning. And that's only possible through discussion and analysis. So a really good qualitative study, at the end of every day, that team comes back together and they talk about what they learned. Because what I learned talking to this woman or men or focus group or whatever might be totally different than what Wachira learned in the same community. And only by talking together do we start to get at the bigger picture, and that informs what we're going to do tomorrow or next time we come back or in the next community. So without that discussion, you don't have any basis to keep going. And then writing and uptake. And the reason I put writing and uptake on here as a critical piece is I think there's a fair amount, there still is largely in many circles a bias towards quantitative data. So when we write from qualitative data, we have to explain what we did and why we did it. And that often when you read qualitative papers, that methodological step doesn't exist, right? In almost every journal paper I review, I say, I don't understand the methodology, right? So when we think about our qualitative data, We want to be able to say, I did a snowball sample of fishers in Loyangalani for this reason. Here's my justification. Here's how I figured out who to talk to. Here's why I, whatever, only talk to men in their 20s. I'm making this up, of course, right? And that we can justify that. And that then I can say, I talked to 27 men who were fishing in Loyangalani who had lost their cattle in the last year and had shifted into fishing. And I did this because XYZ, right? So you want to be able to back up what you're saying. And critically, you want to also always make sure that people understand it is not a representative sample. That's a quantitative sample, okay? You're not trying to get a representative sample in qualitative data. If that's what you're trying to do, you should do a quantitative survey, right? But instead, I want to be able to discuss the lives of fishermen in Loyangalani, men who've lost their livestock in the last year. And I'm able to say, I think I can do that with these 27 interviews because I was no longer learning new things, okay? So this says, don't forget about research ethics and taking the information back. As a lot of you said, and we'll talk more about ethics in our later session today, but any research, but particularly qualitative research, takes a lot of people's time. You are asking people to sit down with you and chat about their lives, their children, their money, their assets. It's super personal, right? So we want to make sure we're doing that for good reasons, for good purpose, that we know what the benefit of our research is, and that we're able to clearly explain that, okay? And that the information has validity for those people. We want to do extractive research. We want to be feeding back, going back to the communities. Every study should include a feedback to the local communities. What did I hear from you? What did I learn? Do you think this sounds right? What the type of person and how we emphasize those skills that many of us already have. You're a good qualitative researcher. So what are some of those skills? Being able to listen. When the woman says, I had 6 kids, but 4 of them died before the age of 5. My next question is not about bicycles, right? Or even if it is, there is a respectful pause where I reflect, I show empathy, I see how she's doing, just as if you were talking to your neighbor who said, my son had a horrible accident yesterday, right? You would then say to your neighbor, oh my goodness, how is your son? What happened? What can I do? Etc. Being curious and inquisitive about what you hear. Often we do trainings for quantitative researchers, and then we pull out the qualitative team, right? And we say, I think, this person and this person would be great for qualitative. Where I'm always looking for people who have curiosity. Because if you're someone who's curious, you are a good qualitative researcher, right? You want to understand why. Why did that happen? That's so interesting. I'd never heard of that before. Thinking on your feet. This is one of the trickiest things about qualitative research. You're hot, you're thirsty, you're tired, you're sitting on a stony rock. You'd like this to end, but you're trying to listen to what this person said and saying, that is super interesting. Why does this person go to Meru instead of Garbatula? Everybody else goes to Garbatula. I'm sorry, did you say that you only go to the market in Meru? Isn't Garbatula closer? Yes. Why do you only go to Meru? Okay, I made that up, right? But that level of curiosity to pick up the differences and follow up and say, that's really interesting, why? And then similar, being able to follow conversation in a natural way. If you're good at talking to people, If you have friends, you're a good qualitative researcher. Okay? And remembering that the respondent is the expert. You are asking them about their life. So technically, you know nothing, right? Because when I ask you about your life, I know nothing about your life. I am learning. And by taking this approach that I am here to learn about your life and to be humble, even if I came in my Toyota or whatever, this is how you be a good qualitative researcher. And it allows you to build trust and comfort with participants through gradual conversation, particularly if you're going back repeatedly. In the case of Eleonora, where you're embedded in a community, you're building trust and rapport. And a critical thing about qualitative research is the balance of empathy and compassion, which is really tricky. Okay, back to the example of the woman who says, I lost 4 of my kids. You want to show empathy and compassion without finding yourself in a difficult position where you feel helpless that you can't do anything to help her. Okay, I think that's one of the hardest parts of hearing people's stories. And it's also okay to always say, do you want to take a break? Or I need a break. Okay, because you're sometimes hearing very difficult stories. I'll say it again, taking good notes. Even if you're recording, even if you're using a digital recorder, you always want to take handwritten notes. And discussing as much as possible and as often as possible with your team. Okay, the next table talk, 5 minutes. Some of you already started talking about this. So if you feel you already did the first question, skip it. The first 2 questions look the same, but they're different. The first question is about implementing. The second question is about analysis, write-up, and dissemination. A lot of you already talked about the challenges of implementing, training, time, expertise. So move on to the second question, and then think about what are ways to counter some of these challenges. Okay, we'll just do this one quickly. 5 minutes, okay? If you need to stand up and stretch, do so, but don't chat.
Good translator, or try to understand very well the tradition, the culture, how to approach the norm, and that's the way to approach. Because exactly the way Lee said, you have to be someone who has no idea what's going on, so you can submit yourself, and then they tell you what you are looking for. And then for the second one, qualitative data needs a lot of time. Writing, you can start to write every day. You can have piles of papers, and to analyze that is a lot of work. And therefore, the dissemination, you need money, you need a budget that allows you to come back and share that information. Or you have to be lucky enough that you can easily reach that community and tell them, this is what I found, this is what I discovered, is that what you told me? And have that ratification from them. And the counterpart for the last question is to have a good translator, to understand the environment very well, the language, the politics of that country, that region, and as much as possible to have a resource that allows you to do that research.
Great, thank you. Anyone else like to share from their table? Yes, table in the back here.
Look at the question 2, that is challenges in analyzing the write-up and dissemination. I think the first one is volume and complexity of the data that you collected. It's a challenge. I think that one does not need any expounding. And the other one is subjectivity and personalization of your preoccupied idea that you have. Right. However much you do study, you tend to involve yourself in the study. Mm-hmm. So that you counter with yourself some of the idea that's coming through from your findings. I think also that one, the third one is maintaining the participant voice in the study, which is also, I guess there's a thin line between the two. But most of the time, to carry on the participant voice in the study, and in the synthesis and dissemination of the study, is a serious challenge for most of the researchers.
Great, terrific, thank you so much.
And also time consuming, so that's the last.
Time for what?
Consuming as a challenge.
Okay, great.
It can be hard to disseminate the information because people are used to visual presentations like graphs and etc.
Absolutely.
But now to counter that, we can do brainstorming just like we are doing here.
Terrific. Great.
Okay. We discussed on the issue, I'll build on what hasn't been mentioned, analysis, write-up, and dissemination. The first thing that 3 people shouted was coding. Yes,
Great.
there's how to narrow down the themes,
Great.
and even how to grasp some conflicting information that may come
Great.
as a result. Yeah, from just one question, but you get various conflicting information. How do we bring them? How do you narrow down the themes so that you have fewer themes? And it can be challenging. We were doing an exercise here earlier in the morning with Ian, and we just getting the categories that you found us discussing here was, it took some time.
Absolutely.
Yes, and then
Absolutely.
The other thing that we said about implementation is that the perception of qualitative research out here in the field and in the industry, so that it affects how your research is even accepted.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Yep.
Generally, qualitative research goes deep, but then you're competing with somebody maybe who has done research, who has surveyed 2,000 people,
Exactly.
and you have only done 35 people, and you want to influence policy.
Right.
So you get eyeballs and side eyes, and sometimes, yes, because you're told these are just few people and in just this small locality, how can we use that information to influence policy?
Terrific. Those are terrific.
Time consuming,
Yeah.
especially with the pastoral context. You find that people are busy, maybe watering the livestock and all these things, so it's time consuming also. And then there's some disruption. As you interview somebody, then a lot has happened, and sometimes you lose your respondent. And for FGDs, we have individuals domination. You find that one person wants to talk more than the others. Then the other thing is also selection of appropriate respondent and methods. Sometimes you end up maybe selecting the wrong respondent and wrong methods in qualitative, and more resources are required, especially transport refund, lunch for the participant and all these things. So that is the challenges. And with data analysis, we have incorrect thematization problem when we analyze in terms of thematic livestock, for example, agriculture, education, and all these things. And we have few applications for data collection, data analysis.
Great.
Yeah.
Terrific. Wow.
The qualitative data methods, and mainly what we saw is that there's the issue of resistance or lack of willingness or lack of commitment from the participants, which might influence the way your data is collected. And then the other issue is the issue of tokenism.
Tokenism. Mm-hmm.
Yes, tokenism from the respondents, which also affects the type of data you're going to collect. And then the challenge facing the analysis, one is how to transform that data that you've captured without misinterpreting or changing the information
Exactly.
to the final output.
Great. Yeah. Terrific. Wow. Great. So some of these, as many of you said, some of these challenges can be countered, and some of them just exist as they exist with quantitative data, as they exist with any type of field work, right? You are always going to be, to some extent, an outsider, even if you're someone from that community, because you're the person taking the notes or observing. You're always going to have your own biases, as do your teams, as do your translators, as do the people helping you find informants. So some of these things we can directly try to counter, and other ones we can account for, right? Recognizing that we have an outsider bias or an elite bias, or that all of us in this room are thinking about the new pastoral narrative. That's a bias for someone who says, no, 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 we want to make all the pastoralists sit down and farm sorghum. They could say, you have a progressive bias. So we all have biases. So we're not necessarily trying to get rid of that bias, but to think about how it's reflecting in your analysis and your writing and your design. Okay? So it's to be aware of it, some of these things, as opposed to trying to fix them. My last slide, many of you have already talked about in your groups, but some of the things in our team's experiences of why these might be particularly relevant tools in pastoral contexts. Many of these you guys have already touched on. One of the big ones is that the rural pastoral cultures are built very much on oral history and tradition, right? So by listening to people, we are respecting an oral tradition of listening and learning, right? As opposed to box ticking. And then the critical element of visiting people in their own environment, which yes, would happen in quantitative data as well, but to be in the environment and trying to understand it. Doing pastoral research and going to the crawls, going to the watering points, going out into the bush, walking the walk to get to these locations. You learn more on that walk then you'll likely learn from any interview with a key informant sitting in the manada, right? Because you start to understand the livelihood and the life in a totally different way. Also, you're able to acknowledge the extent of variability by moving around in these environments. Even just our drive here from Isiolo, from Nairobi, once you get in the ASOL region, the incredible variability we see, the variability of being near the river versus near the town versus near the mountain. What does this mean in these contexts? And then, of course, learning from the local experts, coming back to this role where as a qualitative researcher, you're the pupil. I don't come with my questions and my fancy tablet. I come to listen to your story, right? And then thinking about the debate and the consideration of the different perspectives that people are doing. And being able to look at the in-depth nuance across seasons, locations, etc. And coming back to this flexibility and adaptation. When you learn that there's been a flash flood and someone lost their whole livestock herd, to be able to go to that location and interview those people as they try to recover those bodies of the animals. Right? That is a way to understand a sudden onset shock. That wasn't in my design yesterday, but today it is. And this is the beauty of a qualitative approach where you're able to investigate those components. Okay? And that really allows you to build on the variability and uncertainty in this environment. Does anybody have any questions before we break for tea?
For a very short comment.
I'm ready.
You're ready. No, I mean, that was brilliant, Liz. And lovely to have all of that presented in one session. When we're thinking about changing narratives, I think one of the key things about qualitative research, but it can also be quantitative research, is how we open up.
When we are talking about pastoralism, it will contain some specifics on that context, and then some generics that do apply pastoralism, not even the region, global pastoralism. There could be. So always, while the research had a certain target audience, which should be kept in mind at the first place, then there should be also balance. And with no exception, while you are discussing a specific theme or certain pattern, one of the most interesting things is when you bring out a case study that relates. So instead of putting isolation, the rest, it verifies. So it's matter of follow and orientation. Then once you put that way, what you have seen in context X should be appealing to context Y, which is the place that you have done. I'm sorry for taking long.
No problem. So thinking about how we balance generalization and specifics. And one, I would be able to say, I think that a general pattern is the undermining, the gradual increased vulnerability from protracted or compounded shocks, such as a multi-year drought, combined with an idiosyncratic shock. The husband is killed. The livestock all die in a flood. The livestock are raided. You have to sell all the remaining animals. That's happening at the household level. And I would be able to say the combination of these shock patterns is particularly damaging for pastoral livelihoods. I can't prove it, right? But I would posit that a regression analysis can also not prove it because they can't say why. So again, coming back to this balance, as Robles said, between generalizability and specificity. Does that make sense? Okay. Let's have, okay, one more question, then we'll have a, or comment, and then we'll have a tea break.
So, what, in your view,
Yeah.
what would be the role of emerging technologies like AI?
Ian says, I think that AI is probably, as with most sectors, going to really radicalize the speed and ability to analyze qualitative data, right? Because if what we were doing, or what I was doing, I won't speak for others, 20 years ago, was printing a massive stack of paper and then using sticky notes or different color highlighters and making piles, right? The move of that to qualitative software where you code within software to the use of AI where I can tell AI that I want to look at women's views on sharing of milk in these 30 transcripts, and it will be able to tell me. What AI will never be able to do is, of course, record those stories, right? Or understand the nuance of what matters. So I think there's a danger in, by the way, I know nothing about AI. I've been trying to put it in the category of Twitter, which is something I hope to never have to deal with, but I think AI is probably going to not let me do that. So, however, this is what other people have told me about AI. So I think there's a danger in my limited understanding of AI between throwing all your data in a quick and easy program. It will tell you stuff, right? Just like the thing I read the other day, which if you ask ChatGPT how many rocks I should eat per day, it'll say not, 2 to 3, right? So it will tell you something, but that you really want to be using greater sophistication and writing queries, engaging with AI in a way that you're able to say, that's not what I mean, or I want you to look specifically at this, but not this, right? But I think, that will come, and our skills will improve on how to use it. But I think I think PhDs are going to get much shorter, which I think everybody in this room is happy to hear.